Spartacus, 111 to 71 BC. Chapter 1. In Chains, the Birth of a Gladiator, c. 111 to 73 BC. In the dust and blood of a crumbling republic, where ambition devoured morality and Rome's hunger for conquest consumed nations whole, one man would rise from chains to challenge the might of the greatest empire the world had ever known. His name would echo through centuries: Spartacus. Imagine the roar of the Colosseum before the Colosseum even stood, the clash of iron against iron, the stench of sweat and fear, and the sound of desperate men fighting not for glory, but for survival. Spartacus was not born into greatness. He was not cradled in luxury, nor was he groomed for power. He was born a Thracian, among the rugged mountains and harsh plains where tribes lived and died in the shadows of Rome's expanding empire. His early life is shrouded in mystery, but the Romans themselves recorded him as a man of exceptional strength, intelligence, and leadership, qualities that Rome would soon twist against him when it bound him in chains. As a young man, Spartacus served as a soldier, likely even as an auxiliary in Rome's own legions. He would have known discipline, the rhythm of marching feet, the precision of the Roman war machine. Yet for reasons lost to history, desertion, rebellion, or betrayal, Spartacus fell into Rome's iron grip. Stripped of freedom, beaten and condemned, he was forced into slavery, and from slavery into the savage life of the gladiator. The gladiatorial schools were prisons disguised as theaters, men trained to kill for the amusement of Rome's masses, their blood spilled to entertain the very citizens who cheered their agony. Spartacus was sent to Capua, to the notorious gladiator school run by Lentulus Batiatus, where men were broken down and reforged into living weapons. Here, in the sand, Spartacus learned the cruel arithmetic of survival: kill or be killed, fight or perish, obey or be beaten into submission.
But Spartacus was not like the others. He fought not merely with muscle, but with cunning. He observed, studied, and waited. In the dim barracks of the gladiator school, surrounded by Gauls, Thracians, Germans, and Greeks, he began to whisper of freedom. His voice, steady and determined, struck like a spark in the hearts of the oppressed. These men had been dragged from distant lands, stolen from their homes, and stripped of everything. They were prisoners of Rome, yet within them burned the same fire that smoldered in Spartacus's eyes. One night, whispers turned into plans. Blades were fashioned from kitchen utensils, makeshift weapons hidden in shadows. There was no certainty, only desperation. But desperation, when led by a man unafraid, becomes power. In 73 BC, Spartacus and around 70 of his fellow gladiators struck. Bursting from their barracks, they slaughtered their guards, armed themselves with whatever weapons they could seize, and stormed into the night. What began as a bid for escape would ignite into a war that shook Rome to its very foundations. The story of Spartacus is not merely one of rebellion. It is the story of how a single man, born in obscurity, chained in servitude, and condemned to die for spectacle, defied the greatest power of his age. His name became a rallying cry for freedom. His struggle immortalized in history as both a tragedy and a triumph. For in chains he was forged, and in rebellion he became eternal.
Chapter 2. The Spark of Rebellion, 73 BC. The night was thick with silence when the gladiators of Capua made their move. They were 70, perhaps a few more, armed with little more than kitchen knives, spits, and scraps of iron scavenged from their meager surroundings. but what they lacked in steel, they carried in fire, the fire of desperation, the fire of men with nothing left to lose. At their head, tall and broad, his eyes burning with a will that could not be broken, was Spartacus. The rebellion began not as a war, but as a desperate gamble. They struck their keepers down with fury, overwhelmed by a strength born not of training, but of rage. The gladiator school, once a fortress of discipline and cruelty, erupted into chaos. Chains were broken, doors splintered, and the cries of freedom echoed against the stone walls. They stormed into the countryside, fugitives now, their hearts pounding with terror and exhilaration. The Roman world outside the school was vast and dangerous. Soldiers patrolled the roads, landlords clutched at their estates, and the heavy hand of the Republic extended into every corner. But Spartacus did not flee blindly. He led his men to the shadow of Mount Vesuvius, the sleeping giant of stone that loomed over Campania. Here, among the rugged slopes and dense forests, the gladiators made their stand. It was not safety they found, but opportunity. Word spread like wildfire. Slaves from farms and estates fled their masters to join Spartacus's band. Runaways, deserters, the desperate and the broken, all found in him a leader who saw not slaves, but men. Within weeks, the small band of gladiators swelled to hundreds, then to thousands. Rome had thought them a nuisance, a band of escaped slaves who would be swiftly hunted down. But Rome had underestimated Spartacus. The Senate dispatched a praetor, Claudius Glaber, with a small force of militia to corner the rebels on Vesuvius. To the Romans, this was routine, a simple exercise in discipline. They did not yet understand that they were about to face a man who could outthink them, outmaneuver them, and ignite the fury of thousands. Glaber's men camped at the base of the mountain, confident that hunger and time would do their work. The rebels were trapped, but Spartacus was not a man to wait for death. Using the vines that grew along the mountain slopes, he and his men wove ropes and ladders, descending the sheer cliffs that the Romans thought impassable. In the dead of night, like shadows crawling from the earth itself, the rebels descended behind the Roman lines. At dawn, they struck with ferocity, catching Glaber's forces in disarray. The soldiers who had expected an easy victory were slaughtered, their weapons seized, their pride shattered. Rome had been humiliated. This was no mere band of fugitives. This was an army in the making. With every victory, more flocked to Spartacus's banner. The countryside erupted with rebellion as slaves who had suffered generations of oppression rose against their masters. The fields of Italy became battlefields. The villas of Rome's elite became charnel houses. But Spartacus was not driven by blind bloodlust. His aim, even in these early days, was freedom. He spoke not of conquest, but of escape, of leading his people out of Italy, beyond Rome's grasp, to the lands of Thrace, Gaul, and freedom. It was a dream both fragile and powerful, one that gave his followers hope in a world that had stolen everything from them. The spark had been lit. Rome, arrogant and blind, had yet to realize that the fire would grow into an inferno that threatened the very heart of the Republic. For in the eyes of every slave, in the whispers of every oppressed soul, Spartacus's name was becoming more than a man. It was becoming a promise.
Chapter 3. Fire spreads across Italy, 73 to 72 BC. Italy trembled. What had begun as a handful of escaped gladiators had become something Rome had never imagined possible: an army of the enslaved. As Spartacus and his men descended from the slopes of Vesuvius victorious, they left behind not only the broken remains of Glaber's legions, but also the shattered illusion of Rome's invincibility. In the countryside, word spread swiftly. The gladiator from Thrace had defied the legions, and he lived. The rebellion swelled like a river after a storm. Slaves poured in from villas and estates, carrying with them the scars of lashes, the burns of iron collars, the memory of cruelty that stretched back generations. Peasants, too, poor freemen ground down under Rome's heel, found in Spartacus a beacon of defiance. His camp grew into a chaotic, sprawling horde, numbering tens of thousands, a patchwork of tribes, tongues, and grievances. And yet, in the chaos, Spartacus carved order. He was not content to be a raider, not satisfied to burn and vanish. He forged these desperate men and women into something greater. He gave them structure, trained them in the tactics he had once seen as a soldier under Rome. He took wild courage and molded it into discipline. Where others saw a mob, Spartacus saw the birth of an army. Rome, embarrassed by its earlier failures, dispatched stronger forces. Praetors, consuls, men of authority were sent with thousands of troops to crush the rebellion. To the Senate, it was still unthinkable that slaves could stand against Rome's legions. But Spartacus was not fighting as they expected. He did not march like a Roman general. He struck like a phantom. He ambushed, retreated, and vanished into the hills. He turned the land itself into his ally, striking when least expected, retreating when outnumbered, always forcing Rome to fight on his terms.
The battles were brutal, and each Roman defeat fed the growing fire of rebellion. In the fields of Campania, Roman cohorts fell beneath the weapons of men they had once owned. On the roads, caravans burned, and the cries of the freed rose into the air like hymns to forgotten gods. Villas that had stood as symbols of Roman luxury were plundered, their masters cut down by those they had once called property. Yet Spartacus's vision remained. He was no mere butcher. He sought escape, not endless slaughter. His dream was to lead his people north, through the Alps, back to their homelands. Freedom lay beyond the mountains, beyond Rome's reach. For a time, it seemed possible. His army, now tens of thousands strong, carved a path northward. But the dream was fragile. Not all shared his vision. Many of his followers, drunk with vengeance and power, clamored for plunder, for Rome's blood, for the spoils of war. Spartacus, for all his wisdom and strength, could not silence the thirst for destruction that burned in their hearts. Still, Rome bled. The Republic's pride was wounded. Senators muttered of disgrace. Patricians whispered of ruin. The greatest empire of the known world was being humbled not by kings or armies, but by slaves, the very foundation of its wealth and power. And so the rebellion spread like fire across Italy, devouring fields, shattering chains, turning the land of conquerors into a land of fear. At its heart was Spartacus, not a tyrant, not a king, but a man who carried a vision of freedom large enough to shake the Republic itself.
Chapter 4. The Legions of Rome, 72 BC. The Senate could no longer ignore the storm raging across Italy. Villas lay in ashes, Roman citizens lay dead in the fields, and the countryside swarmed with tens of thousands of armed rebels. This was no longer a nuisance, no longer a matter of local militia or hastily gathered cohorts. This was war.
In 72 BC, Rome acted with the full weight of its authority. The consuls of the year, Publius Varinius and Lucius Cassinius, were dispatched with legions of trained soldiers to crush the rebellion once and for all. To the patricians who filled the Senate, it was inconceivable that their disciplined legions would fail against an army of slaves. They expected a swift, decisive campaign that would restore the order of things. Masters over slaves, Rome over the world. But Spartacus was no ordinary enemy. He did not fight like a king defending a throne, nor like a general bound by tradition. He fought like a man with nothing to lose and everything to gain. His army was not trained in the rigid formations of the Roman legions, but they learned quickly, adapting to his cunning. They moved swiftly, striking where Rome was weakest, disappearing when Rome gathered strength, like wolves encircling a lumbering beast. When Cassinius brought his forces against the rebels, he was caught off guard, ambushed with ferocity. His men were slaughtered, and he himself barely escaped with his life. Varinius fared no better. Time and again his forces clashed with Spartacus's growing horde, and time and again they were routed. The consuls of Rome, men of high station and authority, returned humiliated, their armies broken, their reputations shattered. It was unthinkable. The Republic, conqueror of Carthage, master of Greece, ruler of the Mediterranean, was being humbled by a man who had once worn chains. Senators raged, the aristocracy whispered in fear, for if slaves could rise in such numbers, what was to stop others from doing the same? The very foundation of Roman society trembled.
Meanwhile, Spartacus's army grew not only in size, but in confidence. By now, it numbered over 70,000 Thracians, Gauls, Germans, and Italians, men and women united by a single cause. They were no longer a band of fugitives. They were a people in arms. They raided at will, outfitting themselves with the armor and weapons of the legions they had defeated. What had once been a mob now moved like a true army, drilled under Spartacus's stern leadership, their discipline forged by survival, and their loyalty bound to the man who had led them from chains to freedom. But the dream of freedom was tested. Spartacus still longed to lead his people northward, through the Alps, back to their homelands, where Rome's reach could not follow. It was the only true escape. Yet his followers, tasting victory after victory, clamored for more. Many wanted to march on Rome itself, to strike at the heart of the Republic, to avenge centuries of oppression. Spartacus, wise enough to know the danger, resisted. To march on Rome was to invite annihilation. Still, he could not fully restrain the fury of the thousands who looked to him. The roads of Italy ran red with Roman blood, and in the Senate panic grew. This was no longer a rebellion. This was an existential threat to the Republic, a living reminder that the chains upon which Rome was built could be broken. Spartacus, the slave who had once fought for survival in the arena, had become the commander of an army that defied the might of Rome. And Rome, in its pride and fear, was preparing to strike back with everything it had.
Chapter 5. The Dream of the Alps, 72 BC. The fires of war had burned across Italy, and with each Roman defeat, Spartacus's vision grew closer to reality. His army was vast now, swollen with more than 90,000 souls, men and women who had shed their chains and now marched under his command. They had weapons seized from Rome's finest, horses taken from Roman estates, and confidence that no slave had ever known. For the first time, true freedom seemed within reach. Spartacus, more than a warrior, was a dreamer. He looked north to the jagged peaks of the Alps, their snow-capped ridges like the teeth of gods biting into the sky. Beyond those mountains lay the promise of escape. Thrace for him and his people, Gaul for his Celtic and Germanic followers. There, far from the reach of the Republic, they could return to their homelands to live not as fugitives, but as free men once more. It was the chance to end the war before Rome could recover its strength. And so he marched north. Through the fertile valleys of Italy his army advanced, leaving Rome's legions broken in their wake. The Senate, desperate and humiliated, had sent consuls and praetors to stop him, but Spartacus crushed them all. The road north lay open. The Alps stood within reach. Freedom was a march away. Yet at the edge of salvation, fate betrayed him, or perhaps it was his own followers. For when the mountains loomed on the horizon, when the path to escape lay clear, many among his army refused. They had tasted blood, tasted victory, tasted the power of defiance. To turn away now, to abandon Italy, felt to them like cowardice. They hungered for more, to march on Rome itself, to see the eternal city burn, to strike at the heart of the empire that had enslaved them.
Spartacus pleaded with them, tried to reason, but he was one man against tens of thousands. He could lead, but he could not drag them to freedom against their will. The dream of the Alps, the chance to break free, slipped away like water through his fingers. Instead of climbing the mountain passes, his horde turned back south, deeper into Italy, deeper into danger. It was the great tragedy of his rebellion. For had they crossed the Alps, had they scattered back to their homelands, Rome might never have been able to stop them. But instead, they lingered in the heart of the Republic, where Rome's wrath could gather and strike with full force. Still, Spartacus did not abandon hope. If he could not lead them north, then he would lead them wisely. He continued to outmaneuver the legions, striking where he wished, evading where he must. His victories mounted, and the Senate grew ever more desperate. This was no longer a war for control of Italy's fields and estates. It was a war for the soul of Rome itself. And so, as Spartacus's army turned southward, a shadow loomed on the horizon. For Rome, enraged and humiliated, was preparing a commander not of mediocrity, not of vanity, but of relentless determination. A man who would stop at nothing, who would see Spartacus and his dream crushed into the earth. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. The dream of the Alps had been lost, but the war was far from over.
Chapter 6. Crassus, the Iron Hand of Rome, 71 BC. Rome had been humiliated too many times. Consuls defeated, praetors shamed, the Senate mocked in whispers by its own citizens. The richest empire in the world trembled at the name of a slave. This could not continue. The Senate turned to a man whose ambition was as boundless as his wealth, a man who had made his fortune in fire and blood, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was no stranger to Rome's turmoil. He had clawed his way to power through cunning, ruthlessness, and gold. Where others hesitated, Crassus acted. He had grown rich in the ashes of Sulla's proscriptions, seizing the properties of the condemned, profiting from their deaths. He had built an empire of wealth and influence, but money alone could not buy the one thing he craved most: glory. The defeat of Spartacus, Rome's greatest humiliation, offered him that chance. Appointed with near dictatorial command, Crassus raised new legions, paying for much of the effort from his own staggering fortune. He armed and trained them with discipline as severe as iron. When some of his soldiers faltered, he revived the most brutal of punishments: decimation. Every 10th man was executed in front of his comrades, a savage reminder that fear of Spartacus was not to outweigh fear of their general. Under Crassus, the legions hardened. They became not just an army, but an instrument of terror. Spartacus, meanwhile, continued his march through Italy. His army, though vast, was fraying.
Victory had fed them, but it had also divided them. Some factions broke away, seeking their own plunder. Others quarreled over leadership, tribes clashing within the very force meant to be united. Spartacus still held the core of his followers loyal, but he knew that time was running short. Rome was rallying, and with Crassus now in command, the struggle would become deadlier than ever before.
The first clashes with Crassus proved the difference. Unlike the consuls who had underestimated him, Crassus pressed with relentless discipline. He harried the rebels, cut off their supplies, and drove them southward, away from the safety of escape. Spartacus's army, once roaming freely across Italy, was now being pushed into a corner. The iron hand of Rome was closing in. Yet Spartacus did not break. In every defeat, he turned to cunning. In every setback, he found strength. He struck with sudden ferocity, breaking through lines, escaping traps, refusing to be caged. His genius as a commander shone brightest in the darkest hours. He was no mere fugitive now, no desperate gladiator. He was a general who matched Rome blow for blow, whose name was spoken with fear in the forum itself. But Crassus was patient. He was willing to bleed, willing to sacrifice, willing to grind Spartacus's army down until there was nothing left. He built walls and trenches, not just to trap the rebels, but to strangle them, to starve them into submission. Slowly, the net drew tighter. For Spartacus, the dream of the Alps was long gone. Now there was only survival, only the fight for one last chance at freedom. The rebellion that had begun as a spark was being dragged into its final, desperate struggle. And beyond the southern seas, another shadow stirred. Pompey, the rising star of Rome, marching back from Spain with his legions. If Crassus failed, Pompey would claim the victory. Rome was sending everything it had, for Spartacus had become not just a rebel, but a symbol, a threat to the very order of the Republic. The stage was set for the final act.
Chapter 7. The Eagle and the Wolf, 71 BC. The land of Italy groaned under the weight of war. For nearly 2 years, Spartacus had defied the Republic, humiliated its armies, and turned its fields into battlefields. But now the tide was shifting. Crassus, the iron hand of Rome, had driven the rebels southward, building walls and trenches that cut off their escape, encircling them like prey trapped by a hunter. The net was tightening, and Spartacus knew it. Still, he would not surrender. He was no beaten slave groveling at his master's feet. He was a warrior, a leader, a man who had carried tens of thousands toward freedom. His army, though battered, still burned with defiance. Yet it was fraying at the edges. Factions had broken away, led by chieftains who quarreled with his command. Some sought plunder, others reckless glory, and each division weakened the whole. Spartacus's greatest enemy was not only Rome, but the hunger and pride of his own followers. In desperation, Spartacus sought new paths. He looked south to the sea, to Sicily, an island where slaves had once risen in rebellion before. If they could cross the strait, perhaps the fire could spread again and the war could be renewed. He bargained with Cilician pirates, promising gold and plunder in exchange for transport. For a moment, hope flared, but the pirates betrayed him, taking his payment and vanishing into the waves, leaving Spartacus stranded on the Italian shore with Rome closing in. Crassus pressed harder. He built fortifications to pen the rebels in, starving them of food and supplies. Yet even here Spartacus proved unbreakable.
In a feat of defiance, his men filled the trenches with earth, brush, and bodies, breaking through Rome's lines in a desperate bid for survival. Once more they slipped from Crassus's grasp, striking northward with the fury of wolves hounded to the brink.
But Rome had no intention of letting the prey escape. From the north came another predator, Pompey Magnus, the darling of the Republic, returning from his triumph in Spain with fresh legions. The Senate's games of power turned the rebellion into a contest between generals. Crassus would crush Spartacus or see Pompey steal the glory from his hands. Pompey would march swiftly, eager to snatch victory at the last. And Spartacus, caught between two Roman giants, knew the end was near. Yet he did not cower. He did not beg. He gathered his men, speaking not of despair but of defiance. His words, carried on the wind of desperation, reminded them of why they fought. Not for plunder, not for Rome's destruction, but for freedom. If they were to die, they would die as men, not slaves. If they were to fall, it would be with swords in their hands and fire in their hearts. The eagle of Rome was descending, its talons sharpened by Crassus and Pompey alike. But Spartacus was the wolf, cornered, feral, unbroken. And a wolf, when surrounded, does not submit, it strikes. The stage was set for the final battle, where the dreams of tens of thousands would clash against the might of Rome. A battle that would echo through history as the last stand of Spartacus. Chapter 8. The Last Stand, 71 BC. The winter air bit sharp as Spartacus stood before his men, the torchlight flickering against faces hardened by years of struggle. They were fewer now, their once mighty horde reduced by battles, betrayals, and the unrelenting pressure of Rome. Yet in their eyes still burned the fire of defiance. These were not slaves anymore, not gladiators chained for the amusement of their masters. These were warriors, hardened in the crucible of rebellion, bound together by a dream that had carried them further than any dared imagine. Across the fields stretched Crassus's legions, their standards gleaming, their discipline unyielding, their armor a wall of iron. Behind them lay the wealth and power of Rome, the unshakable pride of the Republic. Spartacus stood with the outcasts, the broken, the forgotten. And yet he did not see defeat in their ranks. He saw men who would rather die free than live as slaves. On the morning of the final battle, Spartacus made his choice. He did not wait for Rome to come to him. He would strike first, like the wolf lunging at the eagle's throat. Mounted on a white horse, he raised his sword high, vowing to carve a path to Crassus himself, to kill the Roman general with his own hand or die in the attempt. His men roared their approval, their voices carrying across the plain like thunder. They would not go quietly into the chains of history. The clash was apocalyptic. The rebels surged forward, a tide of fury, hurling themselves against Rome's disciplined lines. Spears broke, shields splintered, blood soaked the soil. Spartacus fought at the front, carving a path through the storm, his sword rising and falling in a blur of steel. He cut down centurions, drove his blade through legionaries, pressing always toward the standard of Crassus. For a moment, it seemed the impossible might happen again. The rebels drove deep into Roman lines, their fury threatening to shatter the wall of discipline. Spartacus himself, wounded but unbroken, carved closer to his enemy. His followers rallied around him, fighting with the desperation of men who knew this day would be their last.
But Rome was Rome. The legions bent, but they did not break.
Crassus had prepared too well, his soldiers drilled too hard, his fortifications too strong. Slowly, inevitably, the tide turned. The rebels' fury, though terrible, could not overcome the endless grind of Roman steel. One by one, Spartacus's companions fell. The battlefield became a graveyard, the air thick with screams and smoke. Spartacus himself fought like a man possessed, wounds tearing at his flesh, his body soaked in blood, his own and his enemies'. He is said to have pressed so far into the fray that his enemies could not tell if he sought victory or simply the dignity of dying as a free man. Surrounded, outnumbered, he raised his sword once more and roared his defiance, a cry that carried above the chaos, the cry of a man who had lived and died for freedom. And then Spartacus fell, not in surrender, not in chains, but in battle, as he had vowed. His body was never found, swallowed by the carnage, his memory preserved not by a grave, but by the legend that would never die. When the fighting ended, the fields of Lucania were littered with corpses. Tens of thousands of rebels lay dead, their dream buried in blood. Rome had triumphed, but at a cost that scarred its pride forever. For even in death, Spartacus had proven something Rome could never erase, that its slaves, its broken, its forgotten, could rise, could fight, and could shake the foundations of the Republic itself. The rebellion was crushed, but Spartacus, the gladiator who became a general, the slave who became a symbol, lived on, in whispers, in stories, in the unyielding truth that freedom, once kindled, can never truly be extinguished.
Chapter 9. Vengeance of Rome, 71 BC. The battlefield lay silent, strewn with the broken bodies of Spartacus's dream. Smoke curled upward, carrying with it the last whispers of rebellion. The ground was blackened with blood, the cries of the dying fading into the winter wind. Rome had triumphed, but Rome's victory would not end with the clash of swords. The Republic demanded more than the death of Spartacus. It demanded vengeance. It demanded a lesson carved into the flesh of the survivors. Crassus, cold and unyielding, gave the order. 6,000 rebels had been taken alive after the final battle, captured in the chaos, beaten into submission. They were not to be spared, not to be sold, not even to be given the mercy of a swift death. Rome's punishment would be a spectacle, as terrible as it was calculated. Along the great Appian Way, the road that stretched from Capua to Rome, crosses were raised, mile after mile, an unbroken chain of wood and iron. Upon each, a rebel was nailed or bound, left to writhe in agony as the people of Italy passed by. 6,000 crucifixions, stretching like a scar across the land. Travelers walked that road and saw not just bodies, but Rome's power made flesh. Each corpse was a warning, each cry a declaration. No slave would ever again rise against the Republic without paying the ultimate price. The crucifixions lasted for days, then weeks, the stench of death lingering long after the bodies had decayed. Crows circled overhead, feasting on the condemned. Mothers shielded their children's eyes, yet whispered the name Spartacus in fear and awe. The road itself became a monument not to Roman victory, but to Roman terror.
Crassus, having crushed the rebellion, expected glory. Yet in Rome's political arena, triumph was not his alone. Pompey, arriving late from Spain, intercepted fugitives fleeing north and claimed the final victory for himself.
The Senate, ever eager to play its games of power, awarded Pompey greater honors, leaving Crassus with the bitter taste of rivalry. Even in triumph, politics poisoned Rome. But for the nameless thousands who died along the Appian Way, politics mattered little. They had marched behind Spartacus, believing in a dream of freedom, and though they perished in chains, their rebellion had shaken Rome to its core. The Republic had shown its cruelty, but it had also revealed its fear that one man, one gladiator, had nearly undone the might of legions. The crosses rotted, the bodies turned to dust, but the story endured. For every Roman who saw only punishment, there were others who saw defiance. For every senator who celebrated victory, there were whispers among the poor, the enslaved, the downtrodden, that once a man had stood against Rome, and for a moment he had made the impossible real.
Chapter 10. Legacy of the Gladiator. After 71 BC. The crosses rotted away, the bones of Spartacus's followers scattered by wind and time, and yet the shadow of their rebellion lingered. Rome, proud and unyielding, sought to bury the memory of Spartacus under its monuments, to reduce him to a cautionary tale. But legends have a way of surviving, even when carved from the lives of the forgotten. For years after the revolt, whispers haunted the villas of patricians and the markets of cities. Slaves remembered the man who had once broken his chains, who had humbled consuls and generals, who had dared to march against Rome itself. Among the downtrodden, the name Spartacus became more than a memory. It became a symbol of resistance, of hope, of the dream that even the most powerless could rise against the masters of the world. Rome itself changed in the years that followed. Crassus and Pompey, rivals born from the ashes of Spartacus's rebellion, vied for power, their ambitions sowing the seeds of civil wars that would eventually topple the Republic. Julius Caesar rose in their wake, reshaping Rome forever. Yet beneath the grandeur of emperors and the thunder of legions, the story of Spartacus endured. He had not sought crowns or thrones, yet his defiance echoed louder than the triumphs of kings.
Centuries passed, empires rose and fell, but the gladiator from Thrace remained eternal. Historians debated his motives, generals studied his campaigns, poets and chroniclers painted him as a tragic hero. Some saw him as a barbarian who threatened Rome's order, others as a freedom fighter whose courage illuminated the darkness of oppression. Each retelling reshaped him, but at the heart of every story was the same truth. Spartacus had dared to be free. In the modern world, his name still burns with power. Writers, revolutionaries, and dreamers have claimed him as their own. From the pens of Enlightenment thinkers to the cries of revolutionaries in the 19th and 20th centuries, Spartacus became a banner for liberty. His struggle inspired slaves in the Americas, workers in factories, nations yearning for independence. His story was retold on stage, in novels, and in film, each time reimagined, but always carrying the same heartbeat, the indomitable will of the oppressed against the chains of tyranny. And so Spartacus lives on, not as a corpse rotting on a battlefield, not as a body hung on a Roman cross, but as an eternal reminder of the hunger for freedom. He remains the gladiator who shook an empire, the slave who defied the masters of the world, the man who chose to die on his feet rather than live on his knees. In the end, Rome won the war, but Spartacus won immortality. His name outlived the Republic, outlived the Caesars, outlived the empire itself. Even now, more than 2,000 years later, when we speak of courage against impossible odds, when we speak of rebellion and the fight for freedom,
one name rises above the rest, the name of Spartacus.